In part 1, we saw these 6 tests that we can use to compare two values. Let's now see them in action. I'll sort of group them up visually for you into 3 clusters. And let's write a true and a false version for each of these. What is true? 5 is greater than 3. Yes, it is. What's a false statement? 5 is greater than 8. No, it's not. So that would be false. Let's try the greater than or equal. 5 greater than or equal to 5? Yep, sure. 5 is equal to 5, so it's greater than or equal, but it's certainly not greater than or equal to 8. Well, we can do the very same thing with less than. 5 is less than 8, but 5 is not less than 3. 5 is less than or equal to 9. Well, that's true, but 5 is not less than or equal to 4. And in all of these cases where I'm using 5s and 8s and 3s, you can be using variables, of course, and we usually do. Finally, we have the equals test. 3 is equal to 3. That is true. 3 is equal to 6. Not true. And the not equals test. 3 is not equal to 4. That's right. 3 is not equal to 4. 3 is not equal to 3. False. They are the same. And so typically you will be testing variables against numbers or variables against other variables. Let me show you this in action. If frame count is greater than 10, ring the alarm. We're comparing the variable frame count, in this case the system variable, against the number 10. And when we've had more than 10 frames on the screen, we'll do something. This has all of the features that we've been talking about. The word if, notice it has to open with a lowercase. IF are both lowercase. And I have a space after the if, and almost everyone does. Open parenthesis, your test, close parenthesis. I always have a space after my close parenthesis, and again, almost everyone does. And then the action that will be taken if the test is true. And finally, we have a semicolon at the end. This is your prototype if statement. And now we just fill in the red parts. So let's fill in test. For example, we could say if height is greater than 4. We're trying to see if people are tall enough to get onto the ride. We might not have the number 4. We might have a variable. So we compare height against 4 feet. Or we might not even know the value. Maybe it's a different height for different rides. So we compare height against minimum height. These are all perfectly fine tests using variables, numbers or constants, and other variables. So let's take a look at different actions we can take. What might we do? If someone is tall enough, we admit them onto the ride. And maybe we call a function called admitChild. Or maybe we want to remember that they're tall enough, and so we will set a Boolean variable to the value true so we can remember that this test succeeded. Or we might just call some other function, add child to ride, put the kid on the ride, and off they go. Suppose now you wanted to do more than one thing if the action is true. Suppose you wanted to do all 3 of these things. How would you do them? You could, of course, repeat the if statement 3 times. That's terrible. It's redundant. You have to type the same thing multiple times. If you change it, you have to change it multiple places. There's a way to bundle all of these things up into one so you can tell processing this group of statements is just one statement. And it's actually something that's very familiar to us. It's the curly brace convention, the open curly brace and close curly brace. Everything between the open and closed curly brace is treated as one set of statements for the if test, just like everything between an open and closed curly brace is treated as one set of statements for a function. So the open and closed curly brace are performing the very same job here. They're grouping a bunch of statements together into a chunk or a block. And here's how we actually write it. Get rid of that word action, which was just a placeholder anyway, and we move them up. And typically the way we actually format this is to indent the 3 lines and then put the closing curly brace on its own line. That last bit is my convention. I put the closing curly brace on its own line and I line it up with the if. So the line with the opening curly brace and the line with the closed curly brace line up underneath one another, and everything that's inside is indented 1 tab stop. There's an interesting thing going on here. The 3 statements inside, collect money, provide ticket, admit child, all have semicolons. They're all statements we're calling functions. but the block itself does not end with a semicolon. There's no semicolon after the closing curly brace. That's because these curly braces are just kind of a grouping thing. They're not a statement themselves. So the statements inside have semicolons, but the opening and closing curly brace don't. I mentioned in the overview that we could construct if statements that did one set of action if the test was true, but a different set of actions if the test was false. Let's see how to write that. It's really nothing more than a minor change on what we've seen before. Rather than writing if test action, which works perfectly fine, we stick the word else at the end, after the action itself, and we give it another action, ending with a semicolon. And again, either true action or false action or both can be blocks of statements that open and end with a curly brace. So if the test is true, we do the true action. Otherwise, or else, we do the false action. You don't need the else if you don't need it, if you don't have an alternative like we didn't with the red vowel. But if you do want to have an else, here you can do it. When would you have an else? Well, suppose you're at a track meet and you're running, but you're a hurdler. So when you reach a hurdle, now you're jumping. You're only doing one of two things. You're running or you're jumping. How might we write this? Well, we could go back to our template and say, you know what? I have, my condition is, am I facing a hurdle? If I am facing the hurdle, if that's true, jump over the hurdle. If it's not true, then run fast. So I have two alternatives, two things I can do depending on what this test tells me is going on. Here's another example. Suppose that we are the bouncer at a bar and we're checking IDs and we want to make sure people are legal to get into the bar. Well, let's go back and look at our template and let's implement that. The test in this case might be calling a function called valid ID. We hand it patron, who knows what that is, maybe it's a scan of their ID, and it comes back and with a true or false, telling us if the ID is valid. If the ID is valid, we admit them into the club. Otherwise, we send them away. Now, each of these two steps could be composed of multiple steps. So let's see how to do that. Again, we'll put our little template at the top. Here's the structure we have. If the ID is valid, we'll do one set of things. Otherwise, we do a different set. So if it's valid, well, we'll say welcome to the club. We'll stamp their hand. We'll let them in. Otherwise, we say, sorry, you can't come in. We remember their face so that they can't come in again. And all of these functions I'm making up. There's nothing called say. There's nothing called stamp patron's hand. This is just to give you the idea. So notice that each of the blocks begins and ends with a curly brace. And each line inside ends with a semicolon because it's a statement. This kind of thing you see all the time. And this is the way to type it. The line with the if statement, the line with the else, and the closed curly brace all line up. And then the contents also all line up by one tab stop. Processing is not going to enforce these tab stop things on you. You can actually write this any crazy way you want with spaces and returns and blank lines. But formatting your code well is incredibly important. It makes it much easier to read, much easier to debug, and I strongly recommend you use this kind of structure. So now you know everything there is to know about the basics of the if statement. It's all at the top. The keywords are if and else. You don't need the else clause. You can leave it off, but if you do have it, you need to use the word else. They're all lowercase. The test goes between parens. What goes into the test is a Boolean if a is greater than 5, or a function that you call that returns a Boolean. If the Boolean returns true, processing will do whatever is in true action. If it returns false and you have an else clause, it will do whatever is in false action. So that wraps up the basics of the if statement. The if test is going to be one of the fundamental tools in your programming toolkit. It's a fundamental idea that will be with you forever, and you're going to use it all the time in everything you do. Happily, there's not much to the typing. It's all conceptual. Try writing just little test programs to fool around with this and get a feeling for it. Soon you're going to get very comfortable with it. It's going to be second nature. And then if statements and if else statements are just going to be absolutely natural to you.